Welcome to Grandma's Tales. I am so happy you are here with me, tucked in and ready for a journey. Tonight, we are going to visit a very strange and wonderful place. A place where the flowers whisper secrets and the clocks tick in a rhythm of joy. It is a garden where anything can happen, and where even a tiny cup of tea can lead to a grand adventure of the heart. Take a deep breath, little one. Feel your shoulders relax and let your head sink into the soft pillow. Let us follow a curious girl named Alice into the heart of Wonderland, to a party where everyone is invited and every moment is filled with golden light. Alice had been walking for a long time through the woods of Wonderland. These were not like the woods at home. Here, the trees had bark that felt like soft suede, and their leaves shimmered like polished emeralds in the eternal afternoon sun. The path beneath her feet was not made of dirt, but of a moss so thick and velvet-like that her footsteps made no sound at all. Alice was a curious girl, with a heart full of questions and eyes that always looked for the magic hidden in the shadows. As she turned a corner near a large, spreading oak tree, a tree whose branches seemed to reach out like welcoming arms, she saw a house that made her stop and smile. It was a house that looked quite unusual indeed. It had chimneys shaped like long, tufted ears, and a roof made of felt that looked like a giant, elegant hat. The air around the house smelled of wild honey and toasted cinnamon. In front of the house, under the wide, cool shade of the great oak, a long table was set out. It seemed to stretch on forever, disappearing into the soft haze of the garden. The table was covered in a tablecloth of fine white lace, so intricate that it looked like it had been woven by spiders out of moonlight. Thousands of tiny golden dust particles danced in the shafts of light that broke through the leaves above. Alice watched them, fascinated. They looked like tiny glowing stars that had fallen to earth just to join the party. Everything was still, yet full of life, as if the garden itself was holding its breath in anticipation of a beautiful story. The table was set with hundreds, no, thousands of teacups. Alice walked closer, her eyes wide with wonder. Each cup was a work of art. Some were as small as a thimble, painted with tiny, delicate bluebells that seemed to sway in a phantom breeze. Others were as large as soup bowls, heavy and grand, decorated with golden swirls that caught the light and reflected it back in a warm, amber glow. There were silver teapots that looked like sleeping swans, crystal sugar bowls that sparkled like diamonds, and plates piled high with scones. These scones were golden brown, smelling of warm butter and the sweetest strawberry jam you can imagine. In the center of the table stood a tall, tiered stand filled with cakes that glowed with a faint, magical light of their own. At one corner of this vast, shimmering table sat the March Hare and the Mad Hatter. The hare had long, soft ears decorated with small daisies, and the Hatter wore a hat so tall and magnificent it looked like a tower made of silk. Between them sat a small grey dormouse, he was fast asleep, his tiny paws tucked under his chin, using the shoulders of his friends as soft cushions. They looked peaceful there, 3 friends sharing a moment in the golden hour. Alice approached slowly, not wanting to startle them. Even though the table was enormous, the 3 of them were all crowded together at one end, as if they enjoyed being close to one another in this wide, magical world. And they saw Alice approaching. The March Hare and the Mad Hatter cried out, "No room! No room!" But they didn't say it with anger. They said it with a sort of musical playfulness, like a game they had played many times before. Alice looked at the many empty chairs, each carved from dark, polished wood and upholstered in velvet. She smiled gently and replied that there was, in fact, plenty of room. She sat down in a large, comfortable armchair at the head of the table. It felt like being hugged by a soft cloud. She adjusted the ribbons in her hair and looked at her hosts with bright, interested eyes. She wasn't frightened by their strange clothes or their loud voices. She was simply enchanted by the mystery of them. The Mad Hatter looked at Alice with eyes that were very large and filled with a kind of sparkling intelligence. He didn't look mean. He looked like someone who had spent his whole life dreaming. He leaned forward, his tall hat tilting slightly to one side. He didn't ask her name or where she came from. Instead, he asked her a riddle. Why is a raven like a writing desk? Alice rested her chin on her hand, thinking deeply. She watched a small, sapphire-coloured bird hop across the lace tablecloth, picking up a stray crumb of cake. The riddle wasn't a test. It was an invitation to think about the world in a new way, where logic was less important than wonder. The March Hare offered Alice some tea with a grand, sweeping gesture. But when Alice looked at the beautiful pots and cups, she saw they were all empty. "There isn't any tea," the Hare admitted with a soft, bashful smile. Alice didn't get frustrated. In Wonderland, she was learning that the idea of a thing could be just as wonderful as the thing itself. She realized they weren't being rude. They were simply living in a world made of imagination. "It wasn't very civil of you to offer it," Alice said, but her voice was light and teasing. They all laughed together, a sound like silver bells ringing in the woods. The empty cups represented a world of infinite possibilities. You could imagine them filled with anything you desired. The conversation turned to something very special. Time. The Mad Hatter whispered, his voice dropping to a respectful hush, that time was not a thing, but a person. A dear friend who lived in the heartbeat of the world. He told Alice that he had once had a small disagreement with time, and since then, time had kindly allowed it to be tea time forever at this table. Alice looked at the golden sun, which stayed perfectly still just above the horizon. The shadows were long and soft, the colour of lavender and honey. She thought about what it would be like to live in the golden hour forever. It felt like the moment just before you fall into a happy dream, warm, safe, and eternal. She watched the Dormouse wake up for a brief moment. He blinked his tiny, bead-like eyes and began to tell a story in a soft, squeaky voice. It was a story about 3 sisters who lived at the bottom of a well filled with treacle. The treacle, he explained, was sweet and thick and golden. Alice could almost taste the sweetness in the air. The leaves of the oak tree rustled above them, a sound like 1,000 tiny silk fans. The garden was a symphony of soft noises. The clink of a silver spoon against porcelain, the hum of a distant bee, and the gentle breathing of the sleeping mouse. Everything felt perfectly in its place, a masterpiece of peace. As the afternoon stretched on, the Mad Hatter suggested they all move 1 seat to the right. "Since we have no time to wash the cups," he explained, "we simply move to a fresh one." Alice stood up and moved to the next chair. This one was covered in emerald green velvet. She noticed that as they moved around the table, the cups became even more beautiful. She found one that was made of translucent sea glass, glowing with a soft inner light. Another was shaped like a blooming lily, its petals curling perfectly to hold a phantom drink. Alice began to enjoy the rhythm of it all. The movement, the laughter, the shifting perspective. She realized that life didn't always have to go in a straight line. Sometimes, moving in a circle with friends was the most wonderful journey of all. Alice reached out and touched a teapot. It was warm, as if it were basking in the sun. She noticed tiny carvings on its side, scenes of little mice dancing under a harvest moon. The Mad Hatter took out his pocket watch, which was made of solid gold and encrusted with pearls. He shook it gently and sighed, saying it was 2 days slow. He then did something very strange. He dipped the watch into a cup of tea. Alice didn't scold him. She didn't tell him he was being silly. Instead, she asked him if the watch told him the year. The Hatter shook his head, his eyes soft. "The year is far too slow for a watch to keep track of," he said. Alice nodded, understanding that here, a single second of joy was worth more than 100 years of boredom. She felt a deep sense of calm washing over her. The world Alice came from was full of rules, dusty books, and lessons that had to be memorized. But here, in the shadow of the ears-shaped chimneys, she was allowed to just be. She realized that her imagination was a superpower. If she imagined the cup was full of hot, sweet cocoa with melting marshmallows, she could almost feel the warmth in her hands. She understood that the Hatter and the Hare weren't mad. They were simply free. They were keepers of the golden afternoon, guardians of the magic that most people forget as they grow up. The March Hare began to sing a song. It wasn't a song with many words, but it had a melody that sounded like the wind through the pines. The Dormouse mumble-sang along in his sleep, his tiny chest rising and falling in time with the music. Alice looked up through the branches of the oak tree. The sky was a deep, brilliant turquoise, and the clouds were like tufts of spun sugar. She felt very lucky. She was a guest at the most exclusive party in the world, a party where the only requirement was to believe in the impossible. She saw a butterfly with wings like stained glass land on the edge of her cup, and she held her breath, not wanting to break the spell of the moment. The Alice thought about her sister back on the riverbank and her cat, Dinah. She knew they were waiting for her, but she also knew that they were part of this magic too. She realized that everyone she met in Wonderland was a mirror, showing her a different part of her own heart. The Hatter showed her her creativity, the Hare showed her her playfulness, and the Dormouse showed her her need for rest and dreams. She felt a profound connection to the garden and the strange people in it. The table wasn't just a place for tea. It was a place where stories were born and where time stood still to let those stories grow. Eventually, the sun began to dip just a fraction lower, turning the garden into a world of molten gold. Alice knew it was time to continue her journey. She stood up slowly, her velvet chair making a soft hush sound on the moss. She looked at her friends. The Hatter was adjusting his tie, and the Hare was carefully polishing a silver spoon. "Thank you," Alice said, her voice filled with genuine warmth. "This was the most interesting tea party I have ever attended." The Hatter looked up and tipped his magnificent hat. He didn't say goodbye. He simply said, "Remember, Alice, the stars are always there, even when you can't see them." As Alice walked away, she looked back one last time. She saw the three of them, the Hatter, the Hare, and the Dormouse, all leaning against each other under the great oak tree. They looked like a beautiful painting, a tableau of friendship and peace. She laughed softly to herself, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. The smell of the buttered scones followed her like a sweet memory, and the sight of the glittering teacups stayed behind her eyes like a constellation of stars. She felt lighter, as if she could almost float over the mossy ground. She walked back into the woods, but the forest felt different now. The trees seemed to lean in to hear her thoughts, and the shadows were no longer mysterious, but cozy and protective. She realized she was carrying a piece of the tea party inside her. She understood that she didn't need to explain Wonderland to anyone, not even to herself. Some things are meant to be felt, not understood. She felt brave, curious, and incredibly wise for her age. She was Alice, the girl who had tea with time, and she knew that no matter where she went, she would always have a seat at that golden table. The path ahead of her glowed with a soft, guiding light. Alice knew that her adventure was far from over, but she also knew that she was safe. Wonderland was not a place of danger, but a place of discovery. She thought of the Mad Hatter's riddle one last time and realized the answer didn't matter. What mattered was the smile it put on her face. She felt a deep, happy end in her soul, a knowledge that everything was exactly as it should be. The world was a vast, beautiful garden, and she was its most honored guest. Alice learned that a little bit of nonsense is like a splash of color on a gray day. She learned that our minds are vast gardens where we can have a tea party whenever we wish, simply by closing our eyes and imagining the scent of jam and the sound of laughter. And so she traveled on, her heart light and her spirit free. The end. For more audiobooks for preschoolers or 3-year-olds, stay on our channel. Your eyes are closing now, and your breath is slow and deep. Dream of golden afternoons, teacups painted with stars, and a table that never ends. Good night, little one. Sleep in the light of the golden sun.